Good afternoon, it's Tuesday the 10th of October 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. We're delighted to be joined today by Alex Thompson with Eastern Approaches, and of course Alex reporting from his base in the Netherlands. Well, more good news, Mike.
Yes. Happy World Mental Health Day to everybody. World Mental Health Day, it's observed on the 10th of October every year. The overall objective is to raise awareness of mental health issues around the world and to mobilize efforts in support of mental health. And it provides an opportunity, according to the World Health Organization, for all stakeholders working on mental health issues to talk about their work and what more needs to be done to make mental health care a reality for people worldwide. So in honour of that day, the government has announced a £15 million programme, which is going to see 1 million people trained, Brian, in basic mental health first aid skills, because what we need is 1 million people who can identify other people that have mental health issues. The programme is going to improve personal resilience, apparently, and it's going to help people recognise and respond effectively to signs of mental illness in others, and it's designed and will be delivered by Public Health England. So this is what Theresa May had to say. She said, "I want to use the power of government as a force for good to transform the way we deal with mental health problems right across society." Does that give you a warm feeling?
Well, it doesn't, but I'll say first of all, I noticed that she hasn't got her balls. She hasn't got her beads with her. Normally she's got her neck festooned with big beads.
Well, in fairness, this was that little video is from the Tory party conference where she's there in her personal capacity, not as Prime Minister, of course.
I wonder whether it was related to this caring nature. She's toned herself down. Immensely dangerous. Has anybody checked the Prime Minister for her mental health? I don't think so, but perhaps they should. And of course, what are we seeing? We are to believe that Britain has now dropped to a position where the statistics are telling us, the government statistics are trying to tell us that 1 in 4 people have mental health problems or have had mental health problems. 1 in 4 of this nation state. So we're going to train 1 million people to dig out more people who've apparently got mental health problems according to the government. That could be your political views. And don't forget, David Cameron was almost boasting that we're going to see a huge rise in dementia, which is also now being sort of linked into mental health. And according to Mr. Cameron, people are dying. More people are going to die of dementia, although we weren't aware that this was a terminal illness. So this is a very dangerous a political slant, I think, Mike.
Well, it gets better because, of course, everybody will know by now that Richard Thaler has been nominated or has been made Nobel laureate this year for economics. He's won the Nobel Prize for economics this year. Of course, he's co-author with Cass Sunstein of the book Nudge: Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness. And this is what it all comes down to, isn't it? It's about well-being and how happy you are. That's what makes you mentally healthy, I think. Well, he's won the Nobel Peace Prize. Of course, that book was a best book of the year in The Economist and also in the Financial Times. And Sunstein, one of the two, was part of Barack Obama's administration. And he's married to Samantha Power. So it's all a nice little cabal there. But anyway, you know, we've got to say well done to Richard Thaler. And of course, he was the consultant that was used to produce the Behavioural Insights team, the Cabinet Office initiated project to change people's behaviour in the UK. It started life, as they say, inside 10 Downing Street as the world's first government institution dedicated to the application of behavioural sciences. And their objectives remain the same as they have always been, they say, which is 1, to make public services more cost efficient and effective for citizens to use, to improve outcomes by introducing a more realistic model of human behaviour to policy, and wherever possible, to enable people to make better choices for themselves. So how does a government agency enable people to make better choices for themselves?
Because it makes those choices for them,
For
Mike.
them, yes, and
That's
then tells
what's
them
going to happen.
right. So they make the choices for them, and they tell people what their choices are. 100 employees these days. It's no longer just a handful of people. Big business, and of course it was, as I said, set up with Richard Thaler as an advisor, but it was initially set up by Dr. David Halpern, who co-authored the Mindspace document. That's still available on the government website if you want to get hold of it.
Sorry to interject there, Mike. Can we encourage people to read that document, because as you're about to demonstrate, this is a very, very dangerous document, and I think a lot of people have no idea of this whole raft of government policy.
Well, absolutely, because the paper is Mindspace: Influencing Behaviour Through Public Policy. This is all about influencing human behaviour, individuals' behaviour. And here's the key quote: behavioural effects depend at least partly on automatic influences to behaviour. This means that citizens may not fully realise that their behaviour is being changed, or at least how it's being changed. That remains to be an absolutely spectacular statement.
It should be extremely frightening to most people, because what it means is that we've got politicians in power. We know some of them are deviants. We know that some of them are prepared to cover up child abuse if they're not actively involved in it. They are prepared to start wars overseas, lie about torture. But these people are going to use our tax money in order to create an applied behavioural psychology program so that their views are enforced on us, but we don't even know how it's being done.
Well, and it is global, because Behavioural Insights team has offices in London, Manchester, New York, Singapore and Sydney. But let's not forget that, of course, Barack Obama pushed through in 2015 an executive order entitled Using Behavioural Insights to Better Serve the American People, and it encourages executive departments and federal agencies to, quote, identify policies, programs and operations where applying behavioural science insights may yield substantial improvements in public welfare, project outcomes and program cost effectiveness. It's all hidden behind this idea of saving money and doing a better job for the public. But that's not what it's about. It's about changing people's behaviour and them not necessarily knowing how their behaviour has changed. And this has all come from Richard Thaler, who is now a Nobel laureate. So maybe we could bring Alex in at this point and ask you, Alex, what thoughts you have on this.
Well, it is an area, Mike, that I resisted getting into for a while, because if you get into the independent media, you will soon find YouTube suggested videos in the margin, perhaps less so now that things are hushed up in the suggestions algorithm. But you always used to see lots of links suggesting that you should find out about mind control. And something I held off from investigating for at least 3 years when I was getting into the various strands of what we report on. But I'm afraid no longer. And in fact, I've started telling Dutch educationalists in Christian organizations in particular to look into groups like the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. There's a book available as a bootlegged PDF, by the way, called The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations by Dr. John Coleman. But I have my questions about some of his claims. And the better book is by Daniel Estulin. Estulin, a Lithuanian Jew who was in Soviet military counterintelligence and has an absolutely phenomenal mind, and has been in Spain for 30 years or so and now moved to Toronto. So in a slightly clunky translation out of Spanish, that book of his, whose English translation appeared in 2011, is the best insight into this. And Mike, the existence of the Tavistock Institute, which basically carries out mind control jobs for paying customers at the oligarchic level, that is why American nationalist groups for decades have been saying that the Brits in the City of London are the heads of mind control. They really are. And the Brits use this means, particularly the Tavistock Insights, to control US government, culture and politics, let alone the Commonwealth countries and the poorer parts of the world.
Alex, thank you for that. Perhaps I could just really remind people that as the British government brought in this behavioural insights, they were working in the shadows with a French expert. That was a gentleman called Oliver Willier. He was working in the private office of President Sarkozy at the time to develop this form of applied behavioural psychology in France. So there was a joint programme brought forward. None of it discussed openly with the British public, none of it discussed on the floor of Westminster. And the aim was that at the highest levels of the French and British government was the intent. We now see it's a reality, the intent to bring in applied psychology to change the way we think and behave. And of course, what the real agenda is to be able to bring in government policy without the inconvenience of the public saying, well, this is nonsense, dangerous or rubbish, and rejecting it. So if you're not aware of that Mindspace document, Google it. It'll come up as a PDF, read it, and then think that this is not plan for the future. This is reality today.
Don't Google it, DuckDuckGo it or something else instead.
Duly admonished.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to NATO then. Well, of course, the Parliamentary Assembly is going on at the moment. If you remember, this is the assembly where parliamentarians from NATO member states come and get together and have a bit of a confab. And Jens Stoltenberg has given his keynote speech to that assembly now. He has said that NATO is launching a new multinational force in Romania to counter Russia. He says, here in Romania, our multinational framework brigade is now operational. He said that we are also seeing increased Allied presence in the Black Sea. He said that deployments are a direct response to Russian aggressive actions in Ukraine. But he said, don't worry, NATO's actions are purely defensive, proportionate, and entirely in line with our international commitments. So nothing to worry about there, Brian, at all. He said, Russia is our neighbour. Russia is here to stay. We don't want to isolate Russia. NATO does not want a Cold War. Our actions are designed to prevent, not provoke conflict. Is this some kind of 1984 doublespeak? Can you explain to me how creating new forces, new NATO forces active along the Russian border, and how increasing presence in the Black Sea prevents and doesn't provoke conflict?
We could say newspeak. I think what's actually going on here is cognitive dissonance, and we could say this is probably for these politicians is one step away from mental illness. What is the problem? I think the big problem is they haven't got their way in the Middle East. Syria completely lost, totally outflanked by the Russians, and therefore all the rest of their policy at the moment is in no man's land. So they can't give a sensible statement because the whole of the so-called foreign policy and defence policy is in a huge mess. Cognitive dissonance, I think.
Okay, well, the other thing that he was talking about, of course, was cybersecurity. That was the main discussion point at the Parliamentary Assembly. He said that there are an increasing number of cyber attacks on NATO member states and the organisation's allies, and that the alliance is seeking to ramp up cooperation between its members on sharing national expertise in cyber defence and integrate national experiences in its military structure. It's all fantastic stuff. He said we've significantly strengthened the cyber defences of NATO networks, but also helping member states and allies to improve their cyber defences, partly by sharing experiences, sharing technology, exercising, and also by increasing awareness. We're doing a lot to increase the capabilities of different nations to protect their national networks. And it's very much about sharing capabilities, because the capabilities, the skills, the knowledge in different countries vary. So this is NATO driving forward with this. And earlier in the week, I was going to mention this on Monday, but I decided to keep it until we had Alex on the programme. Jeremy Fleming, who's the director of GCHQ, wrote his own piece, which was published by The Telegraph here. It's headlined, GCHQ is coming out of the shadows to protect Britain's economy from cyber criminals. He says, I have spent my whole career in MI5 and now head of GCHQ working to counter the most serious threats to our national security. If I've learned one thing, it's that our adversaries are quick to spot new ways of doing us harm. We see that in the way terrorists are constantly changing their weapons, or states are using their full range of tools to steal secrets, gain influence, and attack our economy. The biggest changes are shaped by the speed of technological advances, in particular the internet. These shifts are affecting virtually everyone on the planet. They offer amazing potential for individuals, communities, businesses, and countries, friends and foes alike. He went on to say that GCHQ is taking a more public role, a more front-facing role in this. And he ended up by saying, it remains the case that much of what we do must remain secret, but I welcome the shift into the public. If GCHQ is to consider to help keep this country safe, then protecting the digital homeland, keeping our citizens safe and free online must become and remain as part of our mission as our global intelligence reach and our round-the-clock efforts against terrorism. Alex, you have commented in the last week or two on this issue of GCHQ and the fact that they're taking a more public-facing role, and the fact that you think that that's perhaps inappropriate. So what are your thoughts on Jeremy Fleming speaking out publicly in this way?
Fleming has been parachuted in because Robert Hannigan left in a huff under a cloud or whatnot. There are some claims as to whether that was related to the Trump dodgy dossier. But be that as it may, Fleming has come in from the British Security Service, MI5, for which I have the highest esteem, both the senior and junior officers, but they inevitably have a different approach than GCHQ. Particularly someone of Fleming's grade. What they're about, or one of the things they're about, is protecting what they sometimes refer to as the A-list of British companies. They regard the British government and the British leading corporations, which they sometimes call UK PLC, as one and the same in aim, and sometimes in manning, of course, because people leave politics and go and sit on boards of companies. So MI5 has always had that attitude of stopping Russian, Chinese, Israeli espionage. Well, Israeli espionage we don't talk about, but it's very aggressive, and South African in the past as well, stopping them from stealing our commercial secrets, our intellectual property. Now he's got into the GCHQ role, he's continuing that, but GCHQ is a very unusual beast in World Signals Intelligence Agency terms, because GCHQ, and this is one of its successes, combines the Signals Intelligence, or SIGINT wing, with the Information Security, or InfoSec wing, that is the poaching and the gamekeeping of respectively other people's and our own information. Now, by thrusting into the limelight GCHQ's InfoSec, the gamekeeping side, by creating this National Cybersecurity Centre in London, renaming it from what used to be the Communications Electronic Security Group, by putting them in the front line and making them sexy, what we have is the public and particularly corporate idea, and policymakers in Westminster getting the idea that GCHQ is there to protect the establishment's assets. Historically, it was about informing the establishment about Her Majesty's enemies' plans overseas. So we get this confusion of what is domestic and what is foreign, and particularly whom we can target for information. So by selling this GCHQ in this way, Mr. Fleming is taking GCHQ off course of its historic mission into an area where some of the things it does, active shaping measures, have now been openly acknowledged to have been unlawful at the time they were done in the early 2000s. And so we've got a very different beast emerging. And finally on this, I would say that by claiming that everyone who is doing something displeasing to the establishment within the country is somehow hacking or suspect of being colluding with foreign enemies to hack secrets, what you're able to do is, of course, use the much lower threshold at law of cybersecurity and protecting assets information in order to target them. And you can drill down a lot further that way than you can by having to meet the higher bar of getting a warrant signed by a Secretary of State for actual traditional signals intelligence, for which you have to prove that there is, a case to answer, or the usual phrase used is probable cause, at least in American law, but the same idea. So many bad aims are wrapped up into one in this.
Yeah.
Alex, if I may, just add a little bit. At Ian Crane's event on Sunday, one of the topics I was talking about was thought leadership, where we're seeing so-called prominent people coming to advise us on how we should think, what we should think about. One of the organisations called itself the Leadership Council. And I was fascinated to see that the chairman was Lord Janvrin, was at one time the Queen's private secretary and a big EU man. He's now come through onto that leadership council. But we also had Lord Brown from the Quadrilla Group, formerly of the Quadrilla Group. And down at the bottom, which I can see on my other screen here, we have Sir John Scarlett, senior advisor to Morgan Stanley. So, as you say, we've got this spin between people working for security services and very large global corporations. But I'm going to say we're now starting to see through the smoke and mirrors that they're now openly saying, well, we're going to lead people to think in the way we want them to think. So we've got this applied behavioural psychology even coming through into this area.
I would add to that, Brian, the two names you fingered there, Lord Des Brown, formerly of BP, and Sir John Scarlett, former C, as he's called, former director of MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, the foreign-based human intelligence people. They are two very leading members of a cabal which came to fruition in the early 2000s and which brought about many of the anti-Putin and anti-Arab nationalist moves, including the 2003 Iraq War. They subsequently got their fingers burned as Russian intelligence got wise to their game in the Russian provinces based around oil and gas speculation, the same model that Gordon Bowden talks about as having been done in other parts of the world. So there's personal revenge involved here. And in particular, Scarlett has got some incredibly nasty allegations against him. Read the Estulin book on Tavistock to see a culling of what whistleblowers from the security agencies have claimed in blogs about Scarlett's involvement. So there's personal vendetta. One other thing quickly, David Ellis would be keen for me to mention this. The best expertise from the signals intelligence outfits, which Britain had at the end of the Second World War, didn't go into GCHQ. They were headhunted for NSA, the American equivalent, and for private corporations, particularly the MITRE Corporation on the west coast of the States. And this is now feeding back into Macron's plans for a single European Union intelligence agency. So it's all about sight of the whole world's data. And once you've got over a critical threshold of 50% of sight of all the world's traffic as a corporation, which has a relationship of contractor to the signals intelligence agencies and actually hold the repositories of data for them, then you can start flicking switches and turning the internet dark.
Well, you mentioned a minute ago that GCHQ in the UK doing some things that weren't necessarily legal not so many years ago, and of course that was involved with the amount of data that was being collected off the wires on the internet. And here you've got a Dutch article, Alex, Dutch eavesdropping referendum on the way is how you've headlined it. And what it says here is that the student activists aim to repeat the success of last year's referendum on the EU-Ukraine Accord by having the Dutch public vote on the new cabinet's intended bill to give even more access to domestic telecoms data. They've already collected the requisite 300,000 signatures and have submitted them to the Electoral Commission for verification. So tell us more.
Well, there is an obscure provision in the Dutch constitution for the obligatory calling of referenda, which will then be binding, will be advisory, not binding referenda, but holding them as obligatory if the Electoral Commission can verify that 300,000, that's about 5% of the population here, have actually urged this to come to a plebiscite. And students have organised it as they have with the previous one. Dutch students are phenomenally quick at waking up these days to the whole agenda, and cultural Marxism, for example, is a term on every young intellectual's lips here now. So this is the second time that this is going to be organised. If it's verified, it will go ahead together with municipal elections next April, if I'm not wrong. And already the new cabinet, which has been taken longer than any previous Dutch cabinet to thrash out, the coalition after this spring's election, they have let it be known, as that Reformatorisch Dagblad article says later down, that they are actually quite keen on stopping this annoying, obscure provision in the constitution, because we're getting into an era when the Germans and Dutch are, particularly those somewhere in the skeptical wing of society, are starting to say, well, one of the ways we can fight the establishment is by insisting on direct democracy and plebiscites for important events. So even by calling for this referendum, even if it doesn't go ahead, they're alerting a lot of people to the fact that the Dutch intelligence agencies are going to be listening to them more or less by standard if it goes ahead.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I wanted to highlight this article on the Daily Mail. The headline is "Britain Makes Battle Plans for War with North Korea. Top brass could send new aircraft carrier before it had flight trials, as Trump says only one thing will work after 25 years of failed talks." It goes on to say one option involves deploying UK's aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth, and they say that this has come from a senior Whitehall source. "We have plenty of ships to send," this Whitehall source said. Type 45 destroyers, Type 23 frigates, Britain's new aircraft carrier could be pressed into service early if things turn south. Well, there was one particular quote I wanted to highlight here. So here it is. "While Kim's threats have focused on the US, British officials fear the UK would be dragged into any war with their regime, which has been sanctioned by the United Nations." And clearly that second comma isn't supposed to be there because I'm not aware that there's been any sanction by the United Nations for war with North Korea at this point. Maybe I'm wrong, but that certainly seems to me to be, well, fake news, Brian.
Yeah. The whole article is extraordinary, isn't it? We send an aircraft carrier. One of the things is this aircraft carrier has not been worked up, would be the Navy expression. And what they mean by that is put through a process of basic and advanced training to get the whole of the crew on board working together properly. And first of all, you've got to do that for the ship, and then the aircraft will be embarked, and then you have to do that second phase. I think what would happen here is they've got to do some basic training, otherwise that ship isn't going to function. But then they're going to say, well, we haven't got the aircraft to bring on board, so unfortunately we're going to have to bring French or American aircraft on board. And at one stroke, what we have is exactly what the UK column predicted about 6 or 7 years ago, which is the agenda to get rid of Britain's national forces and to create this unified EU military structure. So I would think that this sort of talk, Mike, is to help drive this agenda.
But Alex, isn't it amazing how is it a misplaced comma?
Yes, so to be technical, it's a journalist who doesn't know the difference between a defining and a non-defining relative clause, which used to be taught to primary school pupils. I was a little distracted there. By the way, Daily Mail journalists, at least 2 of their main names went to school with me at expensive boarding school, so they have no excuse, although I'm not implicating either of them there. My attention was momentarily distracted there by someone in our chat room saying, as regards the aircraft carrier story, it's like sending a one-legged man to a bottom-kicking party. Except they used another word for bottom.
Yes, well, look, bottom line, of course, it was fake news. So let's remind everybody of Frome Stop Wars Media on Trial event taking place in Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church on Thursday, the 19th of October. Please do get along to this if you possibly can. It's headlined by John Pilger and a bunch of other fantastic speakers at that. £9 in advance. You can get the details for that on eventbrite.com. Just search for Media on Trial and John Pilger, and you'll get that. Okay, £10 on the door, I believe. As I say, any profits that are made on this are going to be donated to help the situation in Yemen.
I'll just add in there that, of course, remember that there are many journalists, I think an increasing number of journalists who are beginning to join the dots up. Many of them are under huge pressure. They're in newspapers where they're warned off particular stories by their own editorial boards. So in putting the media on trial, this is not about simply pointing a finger at what they do wrong. It's also to encourage the better journalists to see what they need to do to get it right.
Encourage or demand?
You can have either. Yes. I think encourage works in the right circumstances, but demand in the other.
Yeah. Okay, Alex, the Dutch Defence Minister has resigned.
This lady is Janine Hennis-Plasgaard, who in the Dutch cabinet model was one of these who kept her in the ministerial post pending the agreement on a new cabinet after the new election. So they're called démissionnaire in the continental model, and they carry on dragging out their ministry for months until the new government's in place. But she has had to kick the bucket even before the cabinet's been signed, because there she was sitting with her mascara and her roots showing, definitely not amused. And in happier days, there she was posing with the other female ministers of defence for the NATO countries, as if that was the main thing to tweet out. There she is earlier in the year in Norway, I believe that was. But there she is looking daggers at one of the 2 members of parliament. And if they had an election tomorrow, they would probably quintuple that figure. One of the members of parliament of the Forum for Democracy party, which only was formed last year, strode into parliament with a very manly beard because he's let it grow as a visual symbol of how long the cabinet's taking to form. So he won't shave it until it's formed. And because the Forum for Democracy has got whistleblowers in the police and military, he strode in with a flak jacket which wouldn't close properly. It had straps right down there, exposing the sternum wide open to ammunition. And he held up these plastic boots and looked the minister in the face and said, "You are supplying our men with this kit and you're going to kill them. You are unfit for public office ever again." And that's what prompted her to look daggers at him like that. They haven't spoken openly about EU military unification. The Forum for Democracy haven't, but we're doing our best. If the next slide shows him striding into Parliament doing that, as reported by the mainstream newspaper, De Telegraaf. Of course, even the Speaker of Parliament told him off. She said, "I found this very inappropriate clothing." But she had no order on the book to stop him speaking, so he used the kit he'd been given, strode into Parliament, and within the 4 minutes he was allocated, I think, in fact, the crucial section was just 2 minutes, made an absolute mincemeat of Mrs. Ploskart, who promptly resigned. And the root of this was that, as I think I mentioned last time, they had an exercise in Mali last year in which a shell went off due to the hot weather, and it was known that this type would do that in hot weather. And Mali is pretty hot, everyone knows that. And that killed 2 servicemen. And the servicemen's mothers have not let that rest, understandably.
Yeah. I mean, I saw some rumours earlier in the week that the Netherlands now actually has a government. What is the status?
It's very difficult to judge what's going on, but behind the scenes, it seems that the mainstream pseudo-conservative parties, which is the VVD and the Christian Democrats, have managed to get all the other parties in which have Christian somewhere in the name or the values to prevent a completely Marxist cabinet. Now, in a sense, that's a good thing, but these are corporatist parties, and as I say, the Dutch are very cute to this now, having been Western Europe's grand sleepers for many decades and not caring about politics really. They've suddenly woken up because Dutchmen vote with their wallets, and they're realizing that they're being taxed to the death now. I think they're ripe for being told about EU military unification, but the current status seems to be that Mr. Rutte will carry on as Prime Minister, and they'll have a grand round of musical chairs. But of course, the outside parties, like the Forum for Democracy there, have branded this the cartel of parties, a phrase which has spread to German political discourse now. And people are realizing that whichever combination of parties you vote for, if it's not an anti-establishment party, you're going to get the same policies and the same musical chairs between government, military, industry and business.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's come right back onto UK news, and Ted Heath, former Prime Minister, is the subject. Reports over the weekend, we'll pick up on the Mail here because this was a positive report, one of the very few, on Chief Constable of Wiltshire Police Mike Veal. What do they have to say? Well, if we just bring in the first chunk, Mike Veal has spent 2 years being assailed by the establishment over his investigation into paedophile allegations against Edward Heath. He's had to bite his lip as mandarins, ex-cabinet ministers, Tory MPs, peers, members of the judiciary and media moguls lambasted his controversial Operation Conifer. And they say here he's been accused of being stupid, leading a witch hunt, and told he'd be forced to resign. So this was a senior police officer doing his job, which the government says should be done, the investigation of child abuse allegations. And when this man did his job, Mike, what happens? The same establishment turns around and vilifies him because he dares to start investigating accusations against a former Tory Prime Minister, Ted Heath. If you haven't read this article, I'd encourage you to do it. It goes on to say he was interviewed since the release of the report, but he's calling for certain things. He's calling for a new inquiry to lance the boil of sinister claims that a Westminster child sex ring was covered up by the establishment. He, I believe, thinks that ring is still in operation. I certainly believe it's still in operation. He said he could have spent 2 or 3 more years investigating Edward Heath if his officers had been allowed to dig deeper. So there we are. The state pulled this man off an investigation into Ted Heath. And what are these papers doing? It's all apology. It's apology. So let's start with Theresa May. I've shown this several times over the last few days, but when she came in, she was going to tackle Trump on the abuse of women. But in the background, of course, she was part of the team as Home Secretary of imprisoning a child abuse survivor and whistleblower, Melanie Shaw, over 14 months in solitary confinement. There can only be one reason that they wanted her out. They wanted Melanie Shaw out of the way while this investigation into Heath went on. What's Melanie been talking about? Well, she's been talking about Jimmy Savile visiting Beechwood Children's Home. But of course, she's one of many survivors in the Midland areas talking about links between political members and abuse, much of which was carried on in London. But there we are. Theresa May did nothing, and she's made no apology for the situation with Ted Heath. So does she condone it?
Good question.
Good question. Well, what's the BBC up to? Well, they're into the heart of it. We've got them coming up with this headline: Wiltshire police faces further Edward Heath question. So it isn't Heath that's under investigation, it's the police, according to the BBC. But they go one better. Look here. And now they've jumped to a story about Cyril Smith. Well, the BBC didn't stand up and complain about the damage to Cyril Smith's reputation at the time. They were quite happy to report. But of course, he was a nasty Lib Dem.
Yeah.
Nasty Lib Dem. So let's go to The Guardian, and then perhaps we'll bring Alex back in. We've got Sonia Soda here saying, is Ted Heath's reputation the victim of a flawed system? Nothing about the damage and pain to child abuse victims, but is Ted Heath's reputation, has it been damaged by a flawed system? Well, she worked hard on this article because if you look at it, she works to confuse the public over the subject. It's Heath's reputation, it's what the police did. There is no mention of the vile crime of child abuse. She drifts people around in this article. I've got to give her credit, it's extremely
well-crafted.
A well-crafted, very clever article. Sympathy for men. She has sympathy for men caught in the rumours of child abuse. She doesn't mention women, so apparently, according to her, well, there's not really any women abusers. The police investigation was against Ted Heath. Well, they were investigating, but we put that little spin on the investigation was against. It was biased because they were investigating him. This is also playing with your mind. Jimmy Savile, don't worry about that. That was just an institutional failing.
Right.
Crown Prosecution Service is rightly clear that it does not say whether somebody dead would have met the threshold for charging. To do so would be to cast an aspersion on those who cannot be tried by the courts. So a nice little spin. We're back on the fact we mustn't say anything about this man because he's dead. The Conifer report consistently uses the word victim when, of course, they can't be a victim until a court has proved they're a victim. So let's squash the child abuse people coming forward. It would be far better properly to resource the underfunded specialist support for those reporting rape. Don't investigate who carried the crime out. Let's help the victims.
That's right, because anybody that's experienced rape, really, they've only got a mental health issue. You've got to deal with that, and then the rape, that just goes away.
Yeah,
you don't have to worry about it anymore.
Push that to one side,
Yeah.
and we'll end here. We rightly have a high evidentiary bar. People are innocent until found guilty beyond reasonable doubt by a jury. But we already know that the state didn't want anybody to get in front of a jury. This is my key question. Don't we have a right to know that this country was ruled by a Prime Minister who it appears has been abusing children? Isn't that the meat of it? Alex, I'll bring you back in here. I've got a little bit more to cover, but I find this woman's report outrageous.
Yes, she is an attack dog, or since she's female, you could use the female word for dog in that phrase, but she's an attack dog. The German phrase for such journalists is a desk-bound murderer. They're well known, this kind of journalist, in the German establishment, but the British establishment has them too, often over the same issues of covering up elite child abuse. Someone in the chat room has been reminding us, Mr. Icke, who can't be rubbished. He was years, decades ahead of others in this game. No, sorry, I shouldn't say game in such a serious matter. In this investigation, David Icke pointed out a long time ago that 5 unconnected victims, alleged victims, have told RAINS, who put out the RAINS list, RAINS, separately about the same fetish, which involved scratching his victims with long artificial claws, and named satanic ritual abuse, which is the thing that even Mr. Veal is not daring or not able to put out at the moment. These aspects will desperately be put a lid on. The corroboration, the specific details of the scratching with claws and the Satanism. And I'm sorry that if people are disgusted by this, but if you call yourself any kind of believer or Christian, you've got to stand up to Satanism and name it for what it is. Otherwise, we're going to go through generations more of this.
Alex, you've raised an absolutely key point. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be very interested in that point, that in the investigation was some specific corroboration by people who did not know each other. They'd never met each other. They were not in the same part of the country, but they talked about some specific things which make the whole balance of evidence extremely strong. But let's follow through on our reporter. Here she is, Sonia, New Statesman covering her. And I love this photo. Sonia Sodha, maybe, former political advisor for Ed Miliband and now leader writer at The Observer. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but hang on, is this woman a journalist or is she a political advisor?
Another good question.
I don't know. I don't understand it. So you go to LinkedIn. What do you find in LinkedIn? Well, you find a nice detail where she's saying, well, of course, I'm helping the BBC, but she's also helping the Institute of Public and Policy Research. That's the bottom line with the blue arrow. So is this lady a bona fide investigative journalist who we can trust because she's unbiased, she's after the truth and facts, or is this lady in bed with a political agenda? Well, if you have a look at her Twitter page, it gets interesting because she comments on part of it here. So I've got this sequence slightly out of order here. But she is picking up an interview that was done saying it would be aware if people were it would be better if people were aware of the basics of our justice system. And so she seems on her Twitter page to be putting across a different view to how Prime Minister Heath should be treated. Apologies for that slight mistake on the slide there. And I asked the question, why would she treat so carefully with the Conservative Party? Well, you go back on what's on the Twitter page, found this one, she's here. She's tied in with this organisation, Bright Blue. And you say, well, this is very interesting. What's Bright Blue? Well, this is about independent think tanks and pressure groups for liberal conservatism.
So she's not independent at all. She has a political ideology, and it's sort of conservative. Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm asking the question because this woman is so defensive. She is protecting Ted Heath up to the hilt. Well, if you look at Bright Blue, you'll find that it's got 138 politicians supporting it. And my eye was cast to number 88, which was the MP Brandon Lewis, who, of course, was the policing minister who refused to take any action when John Wedger met policemen, came to him talking about, surprise, surprise, the abuse and death of children due to abuse that was covered up by politicians, charities and political establishment. So it's a little bit mucky. We get into who the executive team is. We find that it's people linked back through to Conservative policy, and we find that if we go back to the board of directors of this organisation, it leads us back to The Guardian. So, Alex, I'm finding a very incestuous picture around this woman, but I could understand that because of the people she mixes with, she could feel, well, I think very nervous at daring to push the Ted Heath story because it could undermine some of her friendships.
Yes, Brian, there is a particular political signature among those who ridicule any such claims of child abuse and who are interested in power for its own sake. They're found in all the mainstream parties, and they cluster around the left wing of the Conservative Party, the left wing of the Liberal Democrats, and the right wing of the Labour Party. And within each of their own parties, they have more traditionalist left and right wings against them. They're often called blue conservatism or one nation conservatism, orange book liberalism, and blue Labour. All these people are more interested in stampeding to the centre, the radical middle, the third way, the Anthony Giddens philosophy of government, than they are in actual ideological or principled government. There's been a long tradition of this, particularly in Britain and in Austrian circles for a long time, which is triangulate your position between two main points, on the one hand, on the other. And it's all about appearing moderate to suck along the passive thinkers in the population who don't have strong views or experience on things. It is not an accident that the most centrist people at European and world level as well are the most disbelieving of child abuse and the most poo-pooing, because they are people who adulate power and office for its own sake above ideology.
Okay, well, the last man I'll just mention because we're close up for time, Dominic Lawson, also had an article. And of course, he says, well, there can't be any truth in the allegations against Ted Heath because they started with David Icke, as you said. And he says, well, probably, although Mr. Icke called Ted Heath a child abuser while he was still alive, Dominic Lawson just says, well, probably the old boy just didn't want to follow through on it. That is not credible journalism, in my opinion. Okay, we're up for time. I'm getting a strong signal there. Alex, any closing remarks, just very briefly?
Well, what to say, Brian? It's been another roller coaster of a news cycle and a news week. I think I'll say what you often say to make it sound less monotonous coming from me. People in the chat room are saying they're impressed with this information. Well, we appreciate the friendly support. We don't want hero worship. We have had the experience and then the time to think about things, to talk about these issues. Please, please, please do the same yourself in your own circles, in your own family. Don't just consume our information. Raise the open questions among your colleagues, neighbours, friends, family, those who won't openly laugh at you at least. And would you please donate and support us? We are not making a profit out of this, and we are, the more money we get, the more assured we can be of continuing to report on these themes.
Yeah, Alex, well said, and thank you very much. We'll leave it there. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Thank you for joining UK Column. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.